Welcome back to my channel. I was off last week because I wasn't feeling very well, so I am sorry about that. But since time really seems to be flying, it's already time for me to do my first monthly wrap up. So this is going to be hopefully not too long of a video, but a recap of what I read so far this month. So this is probably a fairly definitive list, and I'm going to go through them in the order in which I read them, giving hopefully a quick review. I was hoping to upload more individual reviews, but I didn't quite get around to that. I think I probably will make that a goal for this coming month. Beyond being sick, I was hoping to do at least a couple of uploads a week. So whether it's once a week or a couple times a week, you should be able to see more content from me in February. But since I don't like huge rambly intros, let's just get started. So the first book that I read in January was The Magician's Land, which I'm going to have the book here, hopefully. Because unfortunately for most of these books, I did read them on my Kindle, so I don't have physical copies to show you. I have that for a couple of them, but not all of them. So the first one is The Magician's Land, which is the third book in Lev Grossman's Magician's Trilogy. Um, I mean, RJ at the Secret Stacks has done quite a good overview on the first book, and he also talked a little bit about the show and how it differs. I think his review of the first Magician's book was really good, so I'm going to encourage you to go check that out, and I'll have that link in the description bar below. But what I would say is that I have a fairly consistent problem with the Magicians, and that is that I think at the end of the day, I find it very hard to get along with a lead character that I don't like. And one thing that I've heard in praise of The Magicians is the fact that Quentin Coldwater, who is the lead character throughout all three books, is intentionally flawed, that you're not supposed to like him, that the writer doesn't like him, most of the other characters don't like him, and that it is very much his journey throughout the book, I think, in grappling with being a problematic person or a problematic character. That's fine. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure that that's something I want to read about. And I think that that was the problem. I don't really know why I kept reading after the first book, to be honest, because I knew at that point that it wasn't really something that I was enjoying. But I read through it kind of hoping that there would be more development or something that keep me kind of coming back, and ultimately there wasn't. So I finished up the third book. Essentially, if you're not too familiar with the series, again, I would recommend checking out RJ's video because he does a better job setting it up, and this is the third in the series, so you were kind of far along at this point. But essentially what it is it is correctly or incorrectly billed as being like Harry Potter and Narnia for adults. And very literally what it is that a kid takes a secret exam that he doesn't know is for a magic school, and he goes to what is essentially a university for magic. So he's already done his elementary school and his high school, and this is his version of higher education because he has special magical skills. One of my biggest problems is is the lack of any real female characters. I mean, you have a number of people in it, whether it's Janet, who is kind of a hanger-on to the group that he forms back when he's at university, or Alice in particular, who, if you haven't read the first couple of books, Alice does wind up coming back in kind of a surprising way, but in the end, it just felt like it was there to serve Quentin more than it was there to serve her. And then especially with Quentin's friend, Julia. I was about to blank on her name. But Quentin's friend Julia never really gets any kind of proper development, and you always expect her to. And in a sense, in this book, they really drop the ball because you've been following Julia's story as well. And yet, by the end, she's sort of still unimportant. There's still nowhere that the book wants to take her or is interested in taking her. The show, ironically, has done a very good job of taking a moment to say, like, you know what, no, let's focus on Julia. Let's kind of see the two tracks that Quentin and Julia take when Quentin does get into the school and Julia doesn't, and what that means for the two of them and their friendship and their relationship, and for them individually. So the show is much more interested in doing that, which is why I'm kind of more interested in the TV show at this point. But I will say, as a final book in the series, I mean, it was no better or worse than any of the rest of them. But it sort of solidified all of my problems with the series. The lack of any kind of character development, the fact that Quentin is just awful and I have no interest in reading about him. And I think ultimately the fact that it's often a little bit too cutesy for its own good. Like, it's trying a little bit too hard in a lot of cases, especially when it comes to slang. Like, by the third book, several of the characters that you start with are in this alternate Narnia called Fillory. really, again, this is insane. So you kind of have to get somebody who's better with the description on this. But they're in an alternate Narnia called Fillory, and there's a little bit too much of, I don't know, like an attempt to make it sound like, oh, if a bunch of modern 20 somethings were in this magical land and everybody's using very specific slang. And it does just come off as someone trying too hard to be funny. I can't think of any other way to explain it. I think if you like a Deadpool sense of humor, it is probably something you would enjoy. I've never liked that kind of metatextual humor. And again, I don't know why. I often find it too cutesy. So in the end, the show looks like it'll be promising. The book series wasn't for me, but I think that there is a lot that the show can build on. So that's good news if you want to check out the show. But I would probably recommend giving the books a miss if you haven't started them. And if you have started them, honestly, there's no point in continuing if you aren't enjoying it. So the second one is Winter, which I believe is the fourth book in the Lunar quadrilogy. Also, there were a number of smaller short stories, and then there was kind of like a novella that was put out before this one was released. But in terms of the actual physical books that have been released and that I think count as part of the series, this is the fourth. It's also intended to be the final one. So again, unfortunately, because I'm not starting with the first book, it's a little bit hard to do an outline now to kind of catch you up to speed to this far in the series. So I would assume that anyone who's picking up Winter has read all of the books that precede it. Here's what I'll say. I think this is going to be controversial because I know that a lot of people have enjoyed it. And I really liked Cinder. I really liked the first book when it came out, and I read it probably within a couple months of it being released. I thought it was an inventive way to update the series. I liked Cinder herself. I liked the concept of her being, part cyborg, and that is something that's really easy to, I think, seem hokey or a cheap way of updating the series. And instead, I think they did a lot of interesting things with that. Having said that, I got a little bit worried when I read Scarlet because I kind of felt like I'm not as keen on Scarlet. It's feeling a little bit less inventive in the way that it's being adapted for a kind of futuristic or mechanistic world. And I also felt, even from Scarlet, like you kind of had a big friction between the main story being told, which is ultimately Cinder's story. It's Cinder finding out who she actually is, et cetera, et cetera. That suddenly you were kind of having these new characters introduced where we had to go through and do their full fairy tale update. We had to do their whole arc and their whole story on top of continuing to build Cinder's story. What I suspect, by the time we get to Winter, you can kind of tell that Marissa Meyer is over introducing new characters, and she hasn't 100% thought this through, because to me it feels like this series was pitched to an editor or a publisher as, what'll be fun, we'll do an updated Disney princesses, because Disney princesses are huge. We're going to make it in space, and it's going to be dystopian, and it's going to involve cyborgs and technology and everything else, and it'll be futuristic. And I think in the end, you kind of wind up with a bit of a mess. And that's how it feels. It just feels like another thing's been thrown into the pot. So anytime that it would circle back to Winter's story, and Winter is meant to be Snow White, anytime it would circle back to her story, you could kind of feel the degree to which it felt tacked on. Because at this point, we really just care about Cinder. We really just care about seeing her finish up her storyline. So it felt awkwardly crammed in. I didn't relate to Winter as a character. My single biggest complaint would probably be the love. On the one hand, I want to give not Stephanie Meyer. On the one hand, I want to give Marissa Meyer credit for the fact that she didn't do any love triangles. I'm always pleased with that. Love triangles tend to be kind of awkward, and it seems like manufactured drama. Having said that, I'm going to say something that essentially contradicts that, which is that at the same time, the fact that every single character had to be paired with every single other character reached a point where you thought, oh, what are the chances that they've all found their soulmates aboard this journey or aboard this ship or anything else? And so while there were certain things that were cute, you kind of wound up feeling like it's a little bit Seven Brides for Seven Brothers. Like it almost feels too much like a conceit that every single person's going to wind up with who they were meant to be with, and every single person is meant to be with someone they just happened to meet in the last couple of months. So I found that a little bit goofy. As a final act, I don't know, it felt like a bit of an anticlimax. And it also, like a lot of people have said, the ending feels very convenient. It feels very, is that even possible? Would that happen? Um, yeah, in the end, it just didn't do much for me. I think that they were trying to go for a Hunger Games vibe near the very end, and it wasn't that, and it wasn't really as fun as the first book was. It, like I said, the whole thing kind of wound up feeling like a big mess. So I wanted to like it, but by the time I read Cress, I kind of knew the series was running out of steam, so I didn't have a lot of high hopes for Winter. Actually, what I think was a much better story was that novella prequel that was about Queen Lavanna, because that was a more interesting standalone story, and it did give her time to breathe as a character, hearing that backstory. And then you do have more empathy for Lavanna by the time you read Winter. But you do kind of suspect that what Marissa Meyer wanted to do was to write several updated stories, and they don't work chained together in a narrative like this. And that's kind of where I'm left with on it. So I didn't love it, but I didn't really expect to love it at this point, and I did kind of want to see how everything would wrap up. So number three was the first book that I read for the Canada Reads long list. And so while I was off sick, the short list was announced. And if you remember back to my Canada Reads video, I think I had taken out about 4 books that were on the long list. Every single one of the books that I started reading this month did not make the short list. So I'm a little bit frustrated with that. I'm probably not going to finish the books that I haven't started yet that were on the long list, only because I do want to get to the short list finally. But that was kind of, I don't know, that was kind of annoying. So the one that I did read, which did not make the short list, was All the Broken Things by, I want to say it's Kathryn Kuitenbrouwer or Kuitenbrouwer? I don't know. It didn't make the short list, so who cares? But anyway, All the Broken Things, which very quickly, to give some background on it, is about a young boy who several years earlier had come to Canada with his mother from Vietnam. His mother, he, his father, and his youngest sister are all experiencing different side effects of Agent Orange, which was a highly toxic chemical that was sprayed on the trees in Vietnam, which it turns out was actually manufactured in Canada. So a big point of this story has to do with a certain amount of Canadian guilt about what was done in Vietnam and about which we still haven't apologized for, and that's something that I think Canadian history tends to gloss over. The larger story is about this young boy who is a little bit down on his luck. He's getting into fights. He's finding it very difficult to acclimate to Canadian society. And so he gets offered to, I think, fight bears in a circus by this somewhat sketchy dude. And at the same time, the kind of parallel theme running appears to be that his mother may or may not be prostituting herself out of their house, and that his youngest sister was actually born once they reached Canada, but that the defects from the Agent Orange left her with a lot of physical deformities. I understand the concept of trying to take a moment of Canadian history that should be better explored and should be heard, and that people do need to know about. And I understand shining a spotlight on a very particular group of refugees who were very poorly, who were very hard done by. Here's my concern, and here's why I'm going to guess this didn't get shortlisted. I think white people can write these stories. I think it's legitimate, or it can be legitimate based on how it's told. Having said that, there is a fundamental truth to writing what you know. And part of that fundamental truth is you will always have a better insight to something that you yourself actually experienced. I can't describe it any better than to say that all of these individual elements, whether it's the mother's prostitution or the sister's deformities or this boy feeling alienated from society, I always felt like it was something that was being told to me by an outsider. It didn't have that firsthand account feeling that real immigrant stories have. It did feel like something a white person was telling me instead, or something that they were imagining. And I will also say that the treatment of the sister, who is kept away from prying eyes because the mother's very worried about how the sister will be seen by other people, and the lead character is worried about how his sister will be seen. Again, it felt very strangely patronizing, and anybody that I know who has had a sibling or a child with a mental or a physical deformity, they're not usually patronizing about that person. Like, again, the way that the whole thing felt was as an outsider telling a story that was unfamiliar to them. And I completely respect that it was something that they felt was important, that they needed to shine a light on. It's just, at the end of the day, I don't think this was the person to tell this story. And it did come off feeling a little bit uncomfortable. Now, I want to state very, very clearly, I think people can tell stories that are alien to them. I mean, sci-fi could not exist. Historical fiction could not exist if everybody just had to write things that they knew. In this particular case, it did come off as patronizing, and I can't think of any other better way to say that. I think I was engaged by the book at several points, but that slightly awkward, slightly uncomfortable feeling never really went away, and that was my biggest issue. So the fourth is Jen Campbell, who's also on YouTube and also on BookTube. Her first book, which was Weird Things Customers Say in Bookstores, which is the North American version, which I was slightly annoyed by. So again, now the irony is not lost on me that I got two of Jen Campbell's books about bookstores on a Kindle. I sort of immediately regretted doing that, especially with this first one, because it does, not to diminish the content of it, but it does feel very much more like a coffee table style book that you're supposed to flick through, as opposed to, like, you're not really meant to sit down and read it like a novel, I think, and that's fine. It was really entertaining. If you haven't read it yet, I would really recommend it. There was one small thing that I'll say, which is, and it wasn't actually with any of Jen's anecdotes, but it was with quite a few of the anecdotes that had been sent in to her from Canadian and American booksellers. And that was, I'm a little bit wary of when booksellers make fun of people because they don't know the title of a book. Or one of the anecdotes is, oh, do you have any books by Jane Eyre? And, oh, ha ha ha, she's the character, not the author, etc. I don't know. I mean, I feel like I'm using the word problematic too much. It's not problematic. It's perfectly fine to have those objections or to find that funny in the moment. There were just a couple of those anecdotes that I felt like were making fun of people who weren't as familiar with authors or anything else. The only reason that rubs me the wrong way is that I do feel like it can be a barrier to people getting into reading. If they do feel as though, if they walk in and ask a stupid question, people are laughing behind their back. Again, none of Jen's anecdotes came off that way, and I've never read the Bookshop version, which is obviously the UK one. So I don't know if maybe that's even just a North American problem of us being a little bit snobby about it. But having said that, none of the anecdotes were awful, and most of it was really funny and really cute, and I did enjoy it. So I mean that's really all that matters. So the fifth is one that I'm genuinely shocked didn't make the shortlist. And when I made the original video, I said I guarantee you it'll be on that shortlist, and it wasn't. So that's Station 11 by, since she has the world's longest name, Emily St. John Mandel. I'm really annoyed that this wasn't on the short list. It's fantastic. It's really, really good. Anything positive you've heard about Station 11 is absolutely true. It's inventive, it's smart, it's funny, it's interesting. It does a lot of cool things with the dystopian genre. The characters are all really engaging. It's just a beautiful, light, really lovely book. And the kind of thing that doesn't feel like Canadian fiction. And I think that was something that the shortlist really needed. It needed something that had international appeal, because at the end of the day, if the only people reading Canadian books are Canadians, then that seems like a real shame. And I think that Canadian lit shouldn't just reflect your own culture back to you. Like and that's sort of contradicting what I was saying about all the broken things. But at the same time, I mean, again, maybe it's just bothering me because I really, really loved it. At the same time, I do often feel like these kinds of things, like Canada Reads, is about saying, no, we want to make sure it's insular and Canadian. And to be fair, despite being set in Canada, it wasn't like Station 11 had anything particular to say about Canadians. But then again, that's kind of what I liked. I liked that it was just a really brilliant fiction book, and it wasn't about the snow and sadness and, a small Nova Scotia town coming to terms with, people leaving, etc. Like, it was nice that it felt so much more international and so much more relevant in that way, but was set in Canada, which is not something you don't get to see enough of. So I'm super annoyed that that didn't make the short list, but it is a brilliant book. So if you haven't read it yet, I do definitely recommend it. I sort of don't want to say too much because one of the things that I really liked was that I went in completely blind. And at the end of that first chapter, you get thrown for such a loop for what kind of book you think you're reading, that it was really brilliant, and I immediately felt like I had to keep reading. So it was really good. I'm annoyed it's not on the short list. I guess we'll have to see if there's any rationalization for that, or since I haven't read any of the ones on the short list, I guess I'll have to find out if maybe those ones are all better. They're probably not, but they might be. Oh boy. Okay, so the next one is Landing Gear by Kate Pullinger. I'm just gonna quickly flash the book. Okay, so I did get that from the library. The stickers. This is going to sound a little bit Tumblr precious. I know that ahead of time. I put in a sticker every time the book did something that either made me cringe incredibly hard or every time it did something racist or problematic. As you can tell, that's a lot of racist cringing. Racist is an extreme way to describe the problem with this book. I recognize that, and I am in no way passing judgment on Kate Pullinger. Um, it is possible for an author to write characters that are nothing like themselves, of course. Having said that, if I'm being 100% honest, I hated this book. I hated it a lot. Um, Ugh, I mean, where even to start? So again, and this is strikingly similar to All the Broken Things, and why I'm not at all sad that this did not make the short list, is that it's another book written about an immigrant experience, but written by a white person, and again, written by a white woman. I, I don't want this to turn into the problematic race hour. And again, you can write experiences that are alien to you. These just weren't the books to do it. So the easiest way to explain this is that it's about a young man from, I think, Iran. I want to say Iran. I'm really sorry. So it's a young man from Iran who was stowing aboard the landing gear of an airplane bound for what he thought was the United States, but it turns out to be England. And that one day, while he's stowing on this landing gear, he falls off and lands on the car of this white woman, who is white British woman who lives there. And he lives somehow. I actually thought at the beginning when he got up and started to move that it was going to be some kind of magic realism thing where he's a corpse, but he's still moving around. No, he's totally alive somehow. And they even kind of reflect on the fact that it's impossible that he's alive, but fine, but fine. So he lands in her car, and then she keeps him basically stowed away in a spare bedroom in her house and doesn't tell her family that she's just adopted this random guy. And then the rest of the book is about like her family and the tension that it causes. Here's my problem. Two things. One, she makes a lot of very weird jokes from the perspective of this guy, wherein he's sort of like really weirdly lighthearted stuff about like, haha, women shouldn't be able to speak out in public, or what's another example? I don't know, man. I mean, it was super weird. It was super weird on so many levels. And in the end, not only was she giving you this very skewed, very like weirdly uncomfortably racial profile of this guy who only ever comes off as two-dimensional, but also several characters refer to him as being a magic genie who is fixing their family. And in the end, that's all he is. All he is this weird device to bring all the white people in the story together. And it's super uncomfortable and it's super weird. And again, maybe I missed the point of the book, and I'm not in any way casting aspersions on Kate Pullinger herself, but I'm going to see if I can find a passage that gets through. Like, it is a weird book, man. Okay. Okay, here's a fairly good example, and this is one that I went to randomly. So this is the woman whose car the guy falls on, and she's talking about there's been a kind of major news story that's happened, and here's a lighthearted anecdote or example that she gives. So it says, She monitored news stories and had become fascinated with the way that certain stories started as tiny specks, but then became huge sandstorms, like the way a young man immolating himself in Tunisia became the Arab Spring. I feel like somebody lighting themselves on fire is not like the best way to demonstrate a small thing turning into a larger thing. And that I think, I mean, maybe it doesn't, and you can tell me if it doesn't, but I think it gives you a really good example of how flippant the book is about real problems. And just the way that slang is used. So Kate Bollinger is Canadian, but she lives in the UK, and so it's a book set almost entirely in the UK. There's one scene where somebody goes to Toronto, and that's it. But it's set almost entirely in the UK, and you can feel that she still has that inability to resonate with whatever the local slang is. So she'll say things like, she'll have like two young characters say like, "Oh, he's a real plonker," and I don't know enough about British slang to know if maybe that is something younger people say to each other. It came off as a little bit cloying and a little bit like there's something sort of tin-eared about it, if that makes sense. That's what a lot of the dialogue feels like. All of the approach to teenage characters feels very patronizing, and it's very much like certain elements will be told from the teenage boy's perspective, and he'll go like, "Oh, I'm only pretending to sleep in because you know us teenagers, we have a reputation for sleeping in." Like it's all of it seems like it's only ever coming from the perspective of a middle-aged white woman, and you can feel that at every step of the way. You're never actually connecting with the character of a teenage boy or with a Middle Eastern man or with, even a woman in her mid 20s. You can feel the degree to which it's only ever being told through the eyes of a middle-aged white woman. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, I don't want to use the word problematic. I don't even want to use the word racist. That is a little bit too extreme. It just comes off as sort of insensitive and cloying and uncomfortable. I kind of feel like I have to do a whole review just on this book to explain what I mean better because I don't want to be too flippant. But regardless, if you were thinking of picking it up, I probably would recommend not to. Um, yeah, I should probably do a whole separate review on this because I feel like I have a million things to say and I don't want this to turn into like a 45-minute video. So that's that one. Okay, well, the good news is that the next one is something that I really enjoyed. And it had a number of people have talked about this author on BookTube, and specifically this book because it came out last year, and that is Ali Smith's How to Be Both. So, unlike the last book, this one had stickers every time I really enjoyed a passage because the writing is absolutely beautiful. It is beautiful, beautiful, thoughtful writing. It's poetic. It honestly is probably the best thing I've read in a long, long time. It's it does feel very experiential. So trying to explain any kind of a plot doesn't quite make sense because you do almost feel like it's something that's washing over you. The main I know that Allie Smith gets compared with Virginia Woolf a lot, and I can completely understand why because of the way she plays with gender and because of the way that she plays with perception and time and everything else. But I would say that reading this book specifically actually reminded me more of James Joyce and something like Ulysses. And what I mean by that is more the way in which that she writes in such an imaginative way that it conjures up really interesting images, but that the best way to read her is almost to skim it. Because I think that if you try too hard to go, sorry, what are you saying and what's happening, that you get a little bit too caught up in the details and you don't let all of those really beautiful images just sort of wash over you. And I think that's her real talent, is that if you do kind of let it go at a fast clip, it does read like long form poetry, or it does read um, like something that is much more of an experience or something happening in your imagination than a straightforward novel or a narrative. The other main thing is, so I got the version that starts with Georgie, who's living in a fairly contemporary age. I'd probably say like 2012, 2013. And then the second half is the female painter who I believe is living in about the 1400s. One of the really interesting things about this book is that half of the copies were published with Georgie's version first, half were published with her version second. And what that does to your reading experience it changes obviously the relationship you have with the characters, because I do find that people who read Georgie's version first identify with Georgie, and then you're almost reluctant to move on to this other character. And I've heard the complete opposite if you have the switched version. So it's not like anyone prefers one person over the other regardless of what order they read it in. You really do feel like you identify with this first character, and then it takes you much longer to get into the story of the second person. So that was interesting. I did really love Georgie. I loved the painter. I loved the poetry of it. I did particularly love its approach to gender and gender fluidity, and the concept of what still holds women back. Um, and sort of the possibilities that Georgie has that clearly aren't available to this painter, but also in some ways vice versa. So again, I'm reluctant to give you kind of more of a description of it, because I think it has to be experienced much more than it can be described. But it was absolutely beautiful, and definitely the best thing I read this month. Probably the best thing I've read in about 5 years. I really, really loved it. And I'm going to be reading a lot more Ali Smith probably in the next couple of months. So I'm really excited about that. The next one is another big booktuber favorite, and that's The Art of Asking by Amanda Palmer. Again, something that I read on my Kindle. How did I feel about it? I can't say that I absolutely loved it the way that I know a lot of people have loved it. What I can say instead is that I went through a bit of a rocky experience with it, where it started and I really, really enjoyed the stories that she was telling, and I enjoyed kind of a little bit of her pop philosophy, which was interesting. And then somewhere around the middle, I felt like she was starting to lose me, because it did feel a little bit disoriented and disorganized. You also kind of felt like, because so much of it is about her talking about the backlash that she had from her Kickstarter first, and then later from her involvement in some of the media coverage surrounding the Boston bombings. There is a point at which you feel like she's spending a little bit too much time justifying her participation in those things rather than kind of furthering her point. But the interesting thing happens is that you turn a corner in about the last third of the book, where you start going, oh, no, 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 I can see how you've been laying the groundwork now, so that I completely understand where you are, and I completely understand why you did the things that you did, and I understand why you're saying, your Kickstarter worked because of the personal relationship that you've built with fans, and that's why other people's Kickstarters don't work, is because they haven't taken that time to build a personal relationship. And so by the time she starts describing the ways in which she was attacked, which I remember when that was happening, and I wasn't hopping on a bandwagon of hating her, but I also definitely wasn't that huge a fan of what she was doing either. I was somewhere pretty neutrally in the middle. And when she starts describing, dealing with a lot of personal issues on top of being attacked in the media, and on top of the fact that at the end of the day, she was trying to do something beneficial for herself and her fans and for the people she loves, I think the number one thing I took away from it that I thought was really beautiful was that feeling of, when you see somebody getting dogpiled on by the media, or even just in your own community or your own town or your school or your workplace, there are always a million things going on in that person's life. And there are always a million things about that circumstance that you may not understand. And that at the end of the day, it should always be about trying to support other people. And if you do have criticism with them, that's fine. But then that's something you need to bring to them personally. And a kind of mob mentality doesn't serve anyone. But a mob mentality that's trying to do something for good, that is contributing to, let's say, somebody's album release, or it is contributing to, their medical bills, if that's what they need. Because if they've put out enough positivity and people want to reward them for that, or they want to work within a kind of exchange relationship with them, then that can be a really beautiful thing. And vilifying that in the end doesn't make much sense. So I think she did do a good job of building that. I just think around the middle, you kind of do think like, okay, I get this. I don't need like the millionth example of a time when you emailed a fan, or a time when you tweeted about your ukulele fest or whatever. But ultimately, I got the point of it. And I did think it was really interesting. And I think ultimately, the message that she has is a really beautiful one. And so she has been somewhat unfairly maligned. She's not the most normal person in the world. She seems to be the first person to admit that. But at the end of the day, she is a very caring person, and I think a lot of that message is something, especially in the internet age, that people need to hear. Working towards something positive is always going to be more beneficial for everyone than just dogpiling on someone because it seems like the fashionable thing to do. Okay, the next book that I read was another one by Jen Campbell, which was the Bookshop book. I really loved this one. This one does read a little bit more like a book that you're supposed to physically sit down and flip through. Although, again, because I read it on Kindle, I did hit a point where I started feeling incredibly guilty that I hadn't gone to an actual bookseller and had a conversation or been in their bookstore or rewarded them essentially for still being in a pretty difficult business. I was slightly annoyed that McLeod's books was not included in the Canadian one because McLeod's is an absolutely beautiful, fantastic bookstore in Vancouver that definitely deserves recognition. Although I know she can't put in every bookstore in the world that people want to have included, so that's fine. But yeah, if you haven't read it, it's really interesting. It's really fun. Lots of great interviews with authors and booksellers, and it did give me a lot of hope for kind of the continued relationship with booksellers. And I will say that after I finished reading it, I immediately went to McLeod's and picked up like 5 books because I felt super guilty that I've been giving Amazon all of my book money, which is bad. And I will have a video. I think I'm going to do a video first on defending the Kindle and then on defending the physical book because at the end of the day, I'm not 100% in one camp or the other. And I think there are positives for both. But having said that, having a relationship with a bookseller and having a relationship with a bookstore is really valuable. And that is something that I want to get back to. So thank you for reminding me of that. Okay, so we're starting to get near the end. I only have 2 left. This is one that I actually finished today, which is A God in Ruins by Kate Atkinson. It's a companion, not so much a sequel, to the book she put out a few years ago called Life After Life. If you haven't read Life After Life, what it's mostly about is Ursula Todd, a lead character, is somebody who, for whatever reason, it's mostly told through a lens of magic realism, is able to, as soon as she dies, she comes back. So you return to the point of her birth, and then she's able to live through that life until she dies again. And so it kind of builds on itself. So she does have some kind of memory of the last time that she lived. And so if it's something like, oh, she slipped on a stairwell, then there'll be a moment in her next life where she'll be about to take that step again, and something will hold her back. And so there was quite a bit of interesting dialogue about, maybe there's a reason why you get that weird feeling before you step on an elevator, or maybe there's a reason why you feel like you've seen something before when you actually haven't. It played with a lot of those things. The interesting thing about A God in Ruins is that it doesn't contain any of that. So it's told in a very straightforward, linear way about the story. It's about Ursula's younger brother Teddy, who was an RAF fighter in the Second World War, and talks a little bit about his entire journey. So you see him go from a pre-war period to post-war to the 60s when he has his own kids to then later on, and then I believe near the end of his life, which is a little bit more contemporaneous. So it's about 2012. And it's a good way of discussing all of those time periods because he sort of does see the greatest hits of the 20th century. And then it also deals with the relationship that he has with his grandchildren and his daughter. And the interesting thing is that you'll have Ursula pop up quite a bit, and you don't really know, like, oh, what life would she have been in at this point, or is this even something that's happening anymore, or was any of that real? It's a little bit hard to describe for that reason because it does feel like a companion rather than a sequel because you don't have those elements of magic realism. Uh, but at the same time, the way that it plays with time is really interesting. So even though you don't have him coming back to life every time he dies, instead it kind of has this fluidity where he'll be thinking about his time in the RAF, but it'll be the 60s, and then suddenly he'll project forward to something in the year 2012. And it's not time travel-y at all. It's more that you can kind of feel that it's somebody working through their life almost backwards. So he's thinking back on it from 2012, but he keeps slipping into different time periods while he's thinking about it. And it winds up being a really interesting profile of that post-war period, the pre-war period, the during the war period, um, through one particular lens, and then how a lot of the other movements, like the hippies of the 60s or the kind of all-consuming capitalism of later on. Hello, Dommins. The all-consuming capitalism of later on, and how that kind of changes or fluctuates within one family. I'm not doing a great job of explaining it. It is kind of a hard book to explain because of that fluidity of time. But I would really recommend it, and it's another one that I want to do an individual review on if I can. And then the very, very last one is something that I read pretty much this afternoon because I remember during my book newbie tag, booktube newbie tag, that I said that a big part of my focus was on 19th century American lit. And so I wanted to kind of revisit one of the shorter novellas, which is Bartleby the Scrivener by Herman Melville. And I have a lot to say about this. So what I will say is, if it's something you've been considering reading, I would definitely do that. I will be making a separate video on this. I'll possibly be making a separate video about Melville in general, especially if this is something that you're having to read for school, because I think one thing I will say is, I think it's a very strange book to get school kids to read, especially if they've never had a full-time job, because I genuinely think it is impossible to understand unless you've been in that very particular circumstance. It has a lot to say about capitalism. It has a lot to say about the way that we treat the employee-employer relationship and what happens when someone violates that very specific script of a relationship. And the fact that it was written in the 19th century kind of reinforces how little we've changed, despite the fact that, you know, we've had these major revolutions in terms of unionizing different aspects of work, but that fundamental core relationship that is at its heart rather unnatural, the way that we haven't sort of questioned or upended that has been very interesting. So again, this has been this was my first monthly wrap up. I do feel like I've gone on a little bit too long. If there are things you'd rather see individual reviews of, that's something I'd definitely like to explore. Beyond that, I read 10 books and 1 novella this month. So it was a little bit behind schedule for me because I wasn't able to really read anything while I was sick. But I'd say that's pretty good. It seems pretty good to me. And my aim is probably to read about 15 in February. So if I can get that done, that'll be great. I'm not going to be too hard on myself, but sorry, I got cut off there. I think I went a little bit too long on my camera. So what I was going to say is my overall goal for the year is about 100. I'm going to be doing also an updated video on my reading goals for the year at some point. But for the most part, I've got 100 books that I want to read for the year, probably about 15 for February if I can make that goal. But also, I'm not going to be too rushed. I want to read a lot of different things. I'm definitely going to get the shortlist for Canada Reads done. And then on top of that, I'm going to probably try to squeeze in a couple more Ali Smiths. And also, I still have to read The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro, which I've really been looking forward to. So we'll see. I'm also going to try to focus more on physical books, so I'll have something to physically hold up for you. Otherwise, I hope you're okay with just having kind of a flashing image. But beyond that, let me know, have you read any of the ones that I read this month? Did you have any wildly different opinions about it, or the same opinions? Is there anything that you'd recommend I start with Ali Smith in particular? Or any books you think I'd like based on this? I'd love to hear it. If you enjoyed the video, I know it was really long. I'm going to try to make these more succinct in future. But if you did enjoy the video, then feel free to like below and subscribe if you want to see more. So thank you again, and happy reading. Bye-bye.